The Minister for Education. Minister has the call.
Thank you, sir. I've listened to the speeches from earlier today. I've listened to the contributions from the member for Leigh, the Deputy Premier, and the member for West Torrens. I find it stunning that the member for West Torrens is talking today, because he himself personifies the reason why the committee's report should not be given weight by this parliament, why the parliament, indeed why this chamber, should not support its findings, should have no bearing on the decisions of this chamber. He demonstrated before, during and since a bias that is personal, nasty, to the point almost of being deeply problematic. And throughout this entire debate today, he hasn't stopped shouting, no matter what is going on, no matter what the nature of the contributions being made. As every day in this parliament, he keeps on shouting, He's got an aggression that he can't seem to constrain himself from sharing. And he did it in the lead-up to the presentation of the proposal for there to be a privileges matter. And he did it during the Select Committee inquiry. He did it in public. He's done it in this building, and it's absolutely inappropriate. It actually undermines the integrity of what we can take out of this report. And I urge all members to reflect on that, because it's no small thing to have bias before the committee even starts sitting when considering the matters that are being dealt with. The parliament has before it a motion that is quite significant in its dramatic terms, to the point where it is behoven of this parliament to indeed take very seriously that consideration. I bring the parliament's attention to the words of indeed Dr Gray QC in talking about the importance for members of a select committee taking no bias into the matter, where she said it's important for each member of the committee to bring an unbiased mind to this inquiry, to engage in the fact-finding function of this inquiry free from any preconceptions. I contrast significantly the member for West Torrens and potentially other members of the Labor Party in their perceived bias, their actual bias, with indeed the diligent manner within which the Attorney-General, the Minister for Planning, conducted her considerations in relation to this matter. There are three key matters that I think it's really important that all members of this House seriously consider when forming a position on the vote in front of us. Did the Deputy Premier mislead the Parliament? And indeed, the Select Committee alleges that she did. Not just that she misled, the Select Committee also alleges, and it is beyond me how they can reach this assessment, they allege that she did so knowingly. The second question goes to whether there was a conflict. And the third question is indeed that which I've started to address and I'll come back to again later. Does the committee inquiry's statement that she misled the Parliament amount to any real evidence that she did? Or indeed, is there the possibility, and I encourage all members to think very seriously on this, is there the possibility that members of this Select Committee, prior to suggesting that there be a committee, prior to putting forward their arguments, had already formed the view of what they would find should they be a member of that committee? And if that's the case, you cannot give ground, you cannot give weight to the findings of the committee. And we know very strongly that that's the case. The question comes across, what about Dr Gray?
Member for Playford.
Dr Gray is not a member of this parliament. Dr Gray has not been elected by the people of South Australia to serve in this parliament. Indeed, in the Westminster tradition, we have quite a different way of going about our business to that which is in America. I heard the member for West Torrens, amongst his other shouts earlier, saying that this is like Donald Trump. America has a tradition where people are appointed to investigate and prosecute and aggressively try and bring down political opponents. And this morning we heard the member for Enfield allege that indeed the way that this Select Committee had gone about its business, a novel way, where a QC had been instructed by solicitors at who knows what expense. Sir, I assume you know what expense. Was it $90,000? Was it more? To the people of South Australia, was indeed instructed by solicitors and informed by, I think, 4 members of this Parliament staff. An extraordinary body of work at great cost to the taxpayers, all with one purpose in mind, set up by the Labor Party of South Australia to try and bring down the Deputy Premier of South Australia for the political gain of the Labor Party.
Order.
That is
Member
why
for
the
Mawson.
Labor Party put forward this motion. That is why the Labor Party convinced, I think unfortunately, but nevertheless, they convinced members of the crossbench to set up the inquiry, to support the inquiry. And indeed, its consequence was in effect an American-style investigation that was supported with taxpayers' funds for the pure political motive of bringing down the Deputy Premier at its heart, at its core of being. Is there a member in this House that does not believe that the member for West Torrens had that in mind when he was conducting negotiations with members of the crossbench in relation to the establishment of the inquiry? Does anyone in this House not believe that caucus was discussing this? Maybe even again on Tuesday, when caucus was so long extended that many of them missed an appointment that they promised to have with me and Healthy Harold the giraffe. Is there a single member of this parliament that doesn't think that this is exactly what they had in mind all along? Because if you do believe that there was bias, if you do believe that the member for West Torrens and the member for Enfield went into this committee inquiry with a preconception, with prejudgment of what the outcome would be, then you cannot give weight to the committee's findings. You simply can't, if you believe that they prejudged the matter. The questions in relation to whether the Deputy Premier misled the Parliament, I'll address the comment made by the member for Port Adelaide. The very opening statements of her remarks included this suggestion, this allegation of fact, that the Deputy Premier owned property opposite KIPT property. I'm corrected, sir. I'm corrected, sir. The deputy leader of the opposition tells me that she said she owned property opposite KIPT.
Member for Hammond is called to order.
And look, I will accept.
Member for Port Adelaide is called to order. Member for Playford is called to order.
It was opposite KIPT timber. The fact is,
order.
You have to
Minister for
establish
Transport.
more than the opposition has, or indeed more than the committee inquiry found, because you have to establish first that there was a knowledgeable conflict.
Minister for Industry and
Indeed, that there
Skills.
was any conflict at all. The Deputy Premier has stated that she did not know that it was KIPT timber, as was said. Then the Labor Party, in their committee and in today's evidence, has not established that indeed there was a KIPT property,
Order.
because
Member
it was
for West
not. It was a
Torrens.
privately owned
Member
forest.
for Ramsey.
That indeed was always going to be logged at some point, because that is the purpose of
Member
a
for West Torrens
privately
is called
owned
to order.
forest. And the Labor Party, in
Member for
saying
Ghana.
that the Deputy Premier misled the Parliament, also has to establish that she did knowingly do so. I would submit, sir, that she neither misled the Parliament irrespective or knowingly.
Order.
And certainly not knowing that KIPT had some sort of contractual arrangement, whatever the details of them are. The member for West Torrens seems to be
Order.
very
Member for
deeply
Playford.
of the understanding of the timing and everything else of the contract with KIPT. He can advise the House. But the critical thing is the Labor Party needed to establish that the Deputy Premier knew indeed that KIPT had a contract over that timber to even bring forward the perceived conflict that it is alleged, let alone the actual one. And the actual one, there is a very serious statement to be made in relation to actual conflicts of interest. Somebody is not disqualified purely by being a member of a broad class or a member of a public. Otherwise, anybody on Kangaroo Island would be incapable. Anyone who owned property or lived on Kangaroo Island would be incapable of making a determination in relation to any property matter on Kangaroo Island. Because it is only as a member of such a broad class that the Deputy Premier would have to answer such a claim. It is indeed the Honourable Russell Wortley would be prevented in such a case from answering a claim. The Honourable Frank Pangelo would be prevented in such a case from answering a claim, as indeed property owners on Kangaroo Island. The idea put forward by the Labor Party that because, and it was repeated by every speaker so far, that because the Deputy Premier has, and I quote, a close personal friendship with the former member for Finniss, Michael Pengilly, that somehow makes it a conflict, and there are certain areas there. Deep personal friendship does not amount to a familial relationship. It does not amount to a personal relationship of a spouse or a loving couple. Indeed, it was put forward in evidence to the committee inquiry that the Deputy Premier neither went to school with the member for Finniss. She knew him, obviously, as a member of the island. There are very few people on Kangaroo Island who the Deputy Premier doesn't know. He was indeed a member of this chamber. He was a colleague. He was significantly older than the Deputy Premier, Premier. And it must be said, and this is something of which I have some knowledge, the Deputy Premier did not even necessarily support the Mayor of Kangaroo Island in each and every one of his political endeavours. Indeed, there was at least one occasion that I'm very familiar with where she was supporting somebody else, unsuccessfully. It is absolutely...
Order.
It is absolutely no evidence of the fact that there is a relationship of any sort with the Mayor of Kangaroo Island that would be relevant to the committee's inquiries or the opposition's statements, and yet they have each mentioned it as if this is a salient point. I think that there is a piece of property on Kangaroo Island which was subject of obviously a very tragic set of circumstances. It's very unfortunate that that set of circumstances was brought into the debate in the chamber as part of... Indeed, sorry, I'll clarify. It's very unfortunate that the outcome of that set of circumstances was brought to this chamber as part of the debate as some of the reason why people felt that there was a conflict. That is tawdry, that is inappropriate, and it is deeply unfortunate. The fact is, the Labor Party, its members, its arguers, the people who have put forward the propositions in this debate have continually said that there was a clear recommendation that this approval needed to be offered. The fact is that we know from evidence to the inquiry that it was not so clear-cut. We know from evidence to the inquiry that it was indeed even the provisional recommendation with conditions that was recommended was even then a line-ball decision, and further that any decision was a matter for the Minister for Planning. According to the legislation supported by those opposite, that was the outcome. So the fact that there was a recommendation, the way it was put by the Labor Party is not accurate, and the way it was put has no bearing on this case. There was no misleading of the House, there was no conflict of interest, and the committee report's findings should be given no weight by members of this House. I urge all members to oppose this ridiculous, frivolous, politically motivated, nasty motion.